London, November 1967. The city was still catching its breath from the summer. Sergeant Pepper had come out in June, and the world hadn't been the same since. 5 months later, people were still talking about it. Critics were still finding new things to say. John Lennon knew what they were saying because he'd said most of it himself, in different rooms, to different people, wearing that quiet smile that told everyone he knew exactly what he'd done. That night, he was at Olympic Studios in Barnes. Not a famous session, not something the papers would write about, just Lennon and a handful of musicians working on something that hadn't found its shape yet. The kind of session that happened late at night, when the pressure was lower and the ideas moved slower, and nobody was performing for anyone. Olympic was that kind of place. 3 studios, long corridors, the smell of cigarette smoke baked into the walls. Engineers who had seen everything and reacted to nothing. It was the kind of room where you could make noise until morning and no one would ask you to stop. Half of the records that mattered had been made somewhere along those corridors, and the walls knew it, even if they didn't say so. Lennon was in Studio A. Down the hall, Studio B had been booked by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. He didn't know that at first. The session in Studio A had stalled. The song they were working on wasn't cooperating. Some songs are like that. They resist until they don't, and forcing them only makes it worse. Lennon sat back in the leather chair behind the console, hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling tiles. The musicians in the live room were talking quietly among themselves, waiting. The engineer rewound the tape for the 3rd time and said nothing. That's when something came through the wall. Not clearly, not loud enough to make out a melody, just a presence. A low, sustained pressure that you felt somewhere in your chest before you actually heard it with your ears. Lennon straightened up slightly in his chair. He didn't say anything. The engineer glanced at him, noticed the shift, but didn't comment. They both sat there for a moment, listening to something they couldn't quite hear. Then the sound changed. Whatever was happening in that other room, it had moved into a different register, heavier, more deliberate. Lennon stood up without a word. He didn't announce it, didn't explain himself. He just walked out of the control room into the corridor, the way you do when something is pulling you somewhere, and you'd rather not examine why too closely. The hallway was dim, a few equipment cases stacked against the wall, a water-stained ceiling tile near the fire exit, the kind of corridor that exists only to get you from one place to another, not somewhere anyone stops. He found the door to Studio B slightly ajar. Warm light through the gap. He pushed it open. The room was smaller than he'd expected for how many people were in it. Maybe 8, 10 people scattered around the space. 2 amplifiers pushed against the far wall, both of them running. Microphone stands positioned at careful angles. Cables running across the floor in every direction. The organized chaos of a session mid-flow. The engineer in the control booth sat behind the glass with headphones on, barely moving, watching the room with the professional stillness of someone who has learned that their job, above all else, is to stay out of the way. And in the center of the room, with his back to the door, was Jimi Hendrix. He was wearing a purple jacket that had no business existing. His hair was enormous, pulled upward by some combination of will and physics that Lennon couldn't quite account for. He was standing with a white Stratocaster hanging from his shoulder, talking quietly to his bassist, nodding slowly at something being said. He hadn't started playing yet. The room had that particular tension of just before. Everyone in position, no one rushing, the song waiting somewhere just ahead of the moment. Lennon stepped inside. Someone near the door noticed him. Then another person did. Then, the way these things move through a room full of musicians, word passed from one end of the space to the other without anyone saying anything out loud. Jimmy turned around. "John." He said it simply. Not surprised, not performing surprise for the room. Just acknowledging the fact of him standing there. "Heard you were recording tonight," Lennon said. He leaned against the wall near the door, arms folded. The posture of someone who belongs wherever he happens to be standing. Jimmy nodded once. "You too?" Down the hall. "Not going great." A slight smile crossed Lennon's face. The kind that says, "I can afford a bad night." "Thought I'd come see what you were working on." Jimmy looked at him for a moment. Not reading him, not calculating, just looking. Then he turned back to the engineer's booth and raised two fingers toward the glass. Ready. The room came together quietly. The bassist picked up his instrument. The drummer settled onto the stool and rolled his neck once. Someone near the back moved a step to the left to clear a sightline. Lennon stayed where he was, his back against the wall by the door. Nobody told him where to stand. Nobody needed to. What followed lasted just under 4 minutes. Later, the people who were in that room would try to describe what happened and find that the words kept arriving in the wrong order. Not because the playing was technically impossible to explain. It was a guitar, strings and wood, and an amplifier, a key and a tempo, notes that could in theory be written down on paper. All of it technically describable. But that wasn't what filled the room. It was something in the space between the notes. The way Jimi let a phrase hang in the air long enough to become something heavier than sound. The way he inhabited the music. Not presenting it, not performing it for anyone watching. Just moving inside it the way you move inside a room you've lived in for a long time. His eyes were half closed. His body moved in small, unhurried ways, as though being pulled by something with very little interest in being dramatic about it. The bassist played. The drummer played. But the room, all of it, belonged entirely to what was coming out of that guitar. Lennon didn't move from the wall. He stood with his arms still folded, the same posture he'd walked in with. But something had shifted, somewhere between his shoulders, in the set of his jaw. Something quiet and involuntary. The kind of shift that happens before the mind catches up with what the body already knows. He watched Jimi's hands. Just the hands for a stretch of time. The way the fingers found their positions on the fretboard without looking, without apparent effort, as though they were following music that already existed somewhere ahead of them, and the playing was simply the act of catching up to it. The 4 minutes ended. The room held its breath for a moment. Then the engineer's voice came through the monitors, flat and professional. Good. That was good. Let's keep it. Jimi turned around. He saw Lennon still standing against the wall. Well, Jimi asked. Not challenging, not performing, genuinely asking, the way you ask someone whose opinion you're actually curious about. Lennon uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor for a second, then back up. Yeah, he said. That was it. One word quietly. But the people in that room heard what was behind it. Lennon was not a man who ran out of things to say. When he offered one word instead of a sentence, it wasn't economy. It was the sound of someone working out what he actually thought. He'd said, yeah, the way you say it when you've just seen something and you haven't yet decided what it means for you. He stayed for another 20 minutes. Watched Jimi and the engineer discuss a particular phrase in the second verse that wasn't sitting right yet. Watched them try it again. Watched Jimi adjust his position slightly relative to the microphone, just a few inches, then try it a third time. The ordinary, unglamorous problem-solving that fills the hours between the transcendent moments in any recording session. Lennon watched all of it. Then he said goodnight. Quietly nodded to Jimi, walked back out into the corridor and closed the door softly behind him. The session in Studio A didn't resume until nearly midnight. The musicians were still waiting when Lennon came back. The engineer had found small things to do with the tape while they waited. When Lennon walked back into the control room and sat down, nobody said anything. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the console without seeing it. Let's try something different, he said eventually. Nobody asked what he meant. Nobody asked where he'd been. He picked up an acoustic guitar that had been leaning against the wall since the beginning of the session and started playing something new. Nothing to do with what they'd been working on, just something that seemed to want to come out. The musicians drifted back into the live room and found their way into it slowly, carefully, following without knowing exactly where they were going. The engineer let the tape roll. That recording never became anything finished, but something in the room had changed, and everyone in it could feel that, even if none of them would have known how to say so. Jimi died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. The news moved through the music world in hours, and then sat there, heavy and still, in the way that news about someone young always does. Lennon was in New York when he heard. He didn't give a statement. He didn't appear at the service. He went quiet in the way people go quiet when something has happened that they are not ready to put into language yet. In 1971, in a long interview that covered many things, the Beatles, the breakup, what came next, a journalist asked Lennon about Jimmy. Not about that night specifically. Nobody knew about that night yet. Just, what did you think of him? Lennon paused before answering, longer than he usually paused. I walked into his session once, he said finally, in London, Olympic Studios. He was recording. He stopped again, working out the shape of what he wanted to say. I walked in feeling like myself, you know what I mean? Like John Lennon. There was something close to a rueful smile in his voice. I left feeling like someone who plays guitar. The journalist waited. He didn't perform for me, Lennon continued. He wasn't trying to show me anything. He just played. And I stood there and watched and realized that the picture I had in my head of what music could be, what a guitar could say, I was working from a much smaller version of that picture than I'd known. He looked at something across the room for a moment. It wasn't a bad feeling, he said. It was just very clear. That interview was published. The quote was noted in passing, one observation among many, on a page with other things. Most people who read it moved on, but the people who had been in Studio B that night at Olympic Studios understood exactly what he was describing. They had seen Lennon's face in that room. They had watched him walk in one way and leave quietly changed. They had been there for the 4 minutes that Jimmy played, and for the silence afterward, and for the single word Lennon offered when Jimmy turned around and asked what he thought. Yeah, quietly, just the one word. But none of them had forgotten the weight of it. Some things don't need more than that to last.